By the final weeks of the Second World War in Europe, the idea that Berlin was beyond Allied reach had already taken root in public memory. It is repeated in textbooks, documentaries, and popular history. The Western Allies were too far away, too cautious, or too constrained by casualties to reach the German capital before the Red Army. That narrative is incomplete. By March 1945, Allied forces in the West were no longer fighting a coherent German defense. They were advancing through collapsing lines, overrunning depleted formations, and encountering units that surrendered in bulk rather than resist. German command structures were fragmenting. Fuel shortages were crippling mobility. Air superiority had erased Germany's ability to maneuver or reinforce effectively. In operational terms, the road to Berlin was not closed. Western Allied armies had crossed the Rhine earlier than many planners expected. Once across, they advanced rapidly into central Germany, seizing key industrial regions and transportation hubs. The logistical backbone of the advance, fuel, ammunition, bridging equipment, was intact. Supply lines stretched, but they did not break. By early April, Allied spearheads were deep inside Germany, moving faster than pre-war estimates had predicted. German resistance varied wildly. Some units fought fiercely, many did not. Entire formations disintegrated or surrendered without sustained combat. The critical point is this: Allied operational momentum was real, measurable, and accelerating. At the same time, German defenses around Berlin were formidable on paper, but brittle in reality. The city had symbolic importance, but its defenders were a mixture of exhausted regular units, improvised formations, and hastily mobilized forces. Berlin was heavily fortified, but fortifications alone do not win battles when coordination collapses. Western Allied intelligence was aware of this. Intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations painted a clear picture. Germany was no longer capable of sustained, coordinated resistance across multiple fronts. This matters because the post-war narrative often treats Berlin as uniquely costly, a battle that would have dwarfed previous engagements. Yet Allied forces had already accepted enormous casualties in the advance across France, the Low Countries, and Germany itself. They had fought through fortified lines, urban centers, and entrenched positions when strategic necessity demanded it. The claim that Berlin was avoided purely to save lives does not align cleanly with the operational record. Allied planners routinely balanced casualty estimates against strategic value. They did not shy away from costly objectives when those objectives were deemed necessary. The difference with Berlin was not cost alone. It was priority. By the time Allied forces were within operational reach of the German capital, Berlin no longer occupied the same place in Allied strategic planning as it did in the public imagination. For Western commanders, the primary military objective had shifted. It was no longer symbolic victory. It was territorial control, industrial denial, and the prevention of organized German resistance elsewhere. Armies were directed toward securing regions, not capitals. This redirection is often explained after the fact as purely military logic, but it was inseparable from political guidance. Operational boundaries were drawn, lines beyond which Allied forces would not advance. These lines did not reflect the limits of capability. They reflected decisions. Western armies were instructed to halt advances that, from a purely military perspective, were feasible. Units capable of pushing further were reassigned or redirected. Momentum was converted into consolidation rather than pursuit. This was not accidental. Commanders in the field noticed the discrepancy. Orders did not always match opportunity. Advances that seemed logical on the ground were curtailed by higher authority. Speed was moderated. Objectives were revised. The Western Allies were not racing for Berlin. They were being told not to. It is important to understand what this does, and does not, mean. This does not imply that Berlin would have been taken easily or without loss. Urban warfare is inherently costly. But Allied forces were not being asked to storm Berlin blindly. They were positioned to approach it deliberately, with overwhelming material advantage and complete air dominance. The Red Army, advancing from the east, faced its own enormous challenges. Its assault on Berlin would be brutal, costly, and relentless. Western commanders were aware of this. They understood that Berlin would fall regardless. The question was not whether Berlin would be taken. The question was by whom. And by early 1945, that question had already been answered. Not on the battlefield, but in planning rooms. The myth that Berlin was militarily unreachable serves a purpose. It transforms a political decision into a tactical inevitability. It absolves planners of responsibility by attributing outcomes to circumstance rather than choice. But the evidence does not support inevitability. Allied forces had the means, the momentum, and the opportunity to contest Berlin if ordered to do so. They were not stopped by German resistance alone. They were stopped by lines drawn on maps. Understanding this is essential because it reframes everything that follows. If Berlin was reachable, then its capture by the Soviets was not simply the result of geography or timing. It was the outcome of restraint. And restraint, in war, is never neutral. It reflects priorities, assumptions, and calculations that extend beyond the battlefield. To understand why Berlin was not taken by the Western Allies, we must move away from frontline heroics and toward command decisions, toward operational orders, toward the structure that governed Allied action at the highest level. Because the decision not to push for Berlin did not originate with exhausted infantry or overstretched tank crews, it originated in headquarters. And to understand it, we must examine what Allied commanders were actually ordered to do, and what they were ordered not to do. To understand why Western armies did not advance on Berlin, it is necessary to step away from the front lines and into the structure that governed Allied decision-making. Battles are fought by soldiers, but directions are set by command. And by early 1945, Allied command priorities had shifted decisively away from symbolic objectives. At the center of this system was Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, commonly known as SHE-F. This was not merely a coordinating body. It was the authority that defined operational limits, assigned objectives, and enforced compliance across multiple national armies. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine, SHE-F had already established a hierarchy of goals that placed Berlin conspicuously low on the list. The primary objective was no longer the capture of enemy capitals. It was the destruction of remaining German military capability and the seizure of territory designated as strategically vital for occupation. This distinction mattered. One was symbolic. The other was administrative. Allied planners understood that the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. What remained uncertain was the shape of the post-war order. That uncertainty drove operational decisions more than battlefield considerations. Orders issued from SHE-F emphasized broad territorial advances rather than concentrated thrusts. Armies were directed to clear regions, secure transportation corridors, and occupy industrial areas. The focus was on preventing German forces from retreating intact, regrouping, or surrendering en masse to the West in ways that complicated post-war arrangements. This is often misunderstood. The Western Allies did not simply want Germany defeated. They wanted Germany defeated in a way that aligned with agreements already made about occupation and control. Those agreements included implicit geographic limits. Operational maps produced in early 1945 included demarcation lines. boundaries beyond which Western forces were not expected to advance. These lines did not reflect enemy strength. They reflected political understanding. Commanders on the ground were aware of these limits, even when they were not explicitly described as political. Advance routes were approved or denied accordingly. Requests for altered objectives were filtered upward and frequently declined. This was not a matter of tactical caution. It was compliance. Schaff's directives prioritized southern and western advances over northeastern ones. Armies that might otherwise have driven toward Berlin were redirected toward Bavaria, Austria, and the industrial regions of central Germany. These areas mattered for post-war administration and resource control. Berlin, by contrast, mattered primarily as a symbol. From Schaff's perspective, symbols could wait. Structures could not. Another key factor was the emphasis on avoiding unintended contact between Allied and Soviet forces beyond agreed lines. The possibility of accidental clashes, misinterpretations, or confrontations was taken seriously. Even as the alliance frayed, planners were determined to avoid open conflict before the war officially ended. Berlin sat at the center of this risk. An Allied thrust toward the city would almost certainly result in direct contact with Soviet forces advancing from the east. Such contact might be manageable in theory. In practice, it carried enormous political risk. Any incident could escalate rapidly, undermining fragile wartime cooperation and complicating post-war negotiations. As a result, Schaff's orders consistently favored predictability over initiative. Units were instructed to halt at designated points. Lines were respected even when resistance was minimal. Momentum was deliberately slowed as forces approached areas earmarked for Soviet occupation. This created a peculiar situation on the ground. Allied soldiers often found themselves stopping not because they were stopped, but because they were told to stop. Advances paused despite clear paths forward. Opportunities passed unused. To later audiences, this restraint appeared passive. In reality, it was disciplined adherence to command intent. The casualty argument frequently appears in post-war explanations, but within Schaff's planning, it was not the decisive factor. Casualty estimates for a Berlin assault were certainly discussed. Urban combat was understood to be costly, but cost alone did not determine objectives. Schaff had already sanctioned costly operations when they served strategic goals. What Berlin lacked, in their view, was strategic necessity. Germany was collapsing regardless. Berlin's capture would not alter the surrender timeline meaningfully. It would not preserve Allied lives elsewhere. It would not prevent Germany's defeat. What it might do was disrupt the political framework being constructed alongside the military campaign. From Schaff's standpoint, maintaining alignment with post-war plans mattered more than claiming the final symbol of victory. This logic explains a crucial pattern. As Allied armies advanced, their orders became increasingly administrative in tone. They were told not simply where to go, but where not to go. The absence of Berlin from priority lists was itself an instruction. Western commanders, including some of the most aggressive and experienced officers of the war, complied. Not because they lacked ambition, but because they understood the hierarchy of authority. Schaff's guidance reflected decisions made above the level of military necessity. This does not mean that every commander agreed. Some questioned the logic privately. Others recognized the implications immediately. But dissent did not translate into action. The system functioned as designed. By the time Berlin became an immediate operational possibility, Allied armies were already operating within a framework that assumed they would not take it. Their movements, logistics, and objectives had been shaped accordingly. Berlin was not ignored accidentally. It was deprioritized intentionally. Understanding this reframes the story fundamentally. The absence of Western forces in Berlin was not the result of exhaustion or incapacity. It was the outcome of a command structure executing a broader plan. And that plan was not purely military. It was political, strategic, and anticipatory, designed to ensure that the end of the war unfolded in a controlled manner, even if that meant surrendering the most visible prize. To understand why those political calculations outweighed battlefield opportunity, we must examine the point at which military orders intersected explicitly with political boundaries. Because the lines that stopped Allied armies were not drawn by German resistance. They were drawn by agreement. If you want the classified version of World War II, the decisions made in conference rooms, not the myths repeated later, subscribe to WW2 Declassified. By the time Western Allied forces reached central Germany in the spring of 1945, the limits of their advance had already been defined. These limits were not imposed by German resistance, logistical collapse, or battlefield confusion. They were imposed by political agreement. The most important of these agreements was reached months earlier, far from the front lines, at the Yalta Conference. At Yalta, Allied leaders discussed not only how the war would end, but how Europe would be governed afterward. Central to those discussions was the division of Germany into occupation zones. These zones were drawn on maps before Germany surrendered. They were understood as future administrative realities, not abstract proposals. What is often overlooked is how seriously these future boundaries were treated while the war was still being fought. By early 1945, the occupation zones had effectively become operational constraints. They were not yet enforced by treaty, but they were respected in practice. Military advances were expected to conform to the political geography already agreed upon. This is where Berlin becomes critical. Berlin lay deep inside the zone designated for Soviet occupation. Under the Yalta framework, the city itself would later be divided into sectors, but the surrounding territory was firmly within the Soviet sphere. Any Western Allied advance into Berlin would therefore cross not just a military front, but a political boundary. That boundary was invisible on the battlefield, but unmistakable in command headquarters. Western leaders understood the implications. An Allied capture of Berlin would not simply be a military success. It would alter the post-war balance negotiated with the Soviet Union. It would raise questions about the validity of prior agreements and invite demands for renegotiation under conditions of heightened tension. In short, it would turn the end of the war into a diplomatic crisis. To avoid that outcome, political boundaries were treated as real, enforceable limits long before they became physical ones. Advance lines were drawn that aligned with anticipated occupation zones. These lines were communicated downward through command structures, embedded in operational planning, and enforced with discipline. The result was restraint by design. From the perspective of Allied headquarters, this restraint was not a concession. It was compliance with a broader strategy. The war was being ended in a way that preserved alliance cohesion, at least on paper, through the moment of victory. This logic explains why Western commanders were not authorized to exploit openings that would take them toward Berlin. Such movements were not forbidden because they were dangerous. They were forbidden because they were politically disruptive. The emphasis on avoiding disruption was paramount. Allied leaders were acutely aware that the alliance with the Soviet Union was fragile. Trust was limited. Communication was imperfect. The risk of misunderstanding was high. In that environment, unilateral moves toward politically sensitive objectives were seen as reckless. Berlin was the most sensitive objective of all. The city was not just a capital. It was a symbol of victory, legitimacy, and authority. Whoever took Berlin would shape the narrative of the war's end. That narrative carried consequences far beyond Germany. Western leaders calculated that allowing the Soviet Union to take Berlin would cost less politically than contesting it. This calculation was reinforced by assumptions that would later prove deeply flawed. There was a belief that cooperation could continue after victory, that shared administration of Germany would moderate behavior, that Soviet control of Berlin would be balanced by Allied influence elsewhere. These beliefs made restraint seem reasonable. The alternative, racing for Berlin, was viewed as destabilizing. It risked confrontation at the very moment victory was being consolidated. It threatened to unravel agreements painstakingly negotiated under wartime pressure. From a political standpoint, restraint was the safer option. This is why the advance lines mattered so much. They were not arbitrary. They were the physical expression of political compromise. Once drawn, they acquired a kind of authority that rivaled battlefield realities. Allied commanders understood this implicitly. They knew that crossing those lines would not be judged as tactical initiative, but as political defiance. And so, they did not cross them. This does not mean that the Western Allies were passive or naive. They were making a calculated decision to prioritize stability over symbolism. But it does mean that the fall of Berlin was shaped by agreement more than by combat. The city was not lost in the fog of war. It was assigned. This assignment was never framed publicly as a concession. It was presented as inevitability. Geography was emphasized. Casualties were highlighted. The complexity of urban combat was stressed. What was rarely acknowledged was the existence of a line, drawn in advance, respected in practice, and decisive in outcome. That line ensured that when Soviet forces entered Berlin, they did so without Western competition. The consequences of this decision were immediate and enduring. Control of Berlin gave the Soviet Union not just a symbolic victory, but a powerful bargaining position in post-war negotiations. It allowed facts on the ground to replace promises on paper. And once those facts were established, they proved extraordinarily difficult to reverse. Understanding this moment requires abandoning the comforting idea that Berlin's fate was decided by chance or necessity. It was decided by choice, by a deliberate decision to respect political boundaries even when military opportunity beckoned. That choice reflected priorities. It reflected fear of escalation. It reflected hope for cooperation. And it reflected a belief that what happened after the war mattered as much as how the war ended. Whether that belief was justified is another question entirely, because the decision to let Berlin fall without contest did not end tension. It deferred it, and the city that was avoided in 1945 would become one of the most contested spaces on Earth for decades to come. Of all the explanations offered after the war for why the Western Allies did not advance on Berlin, one has proven the most durable and the most emotionally persuasive: casualties. The argument is simple. Berlin was a massive city. Urban combat is brutal. An assault would have cost tens of thousands of lives. With Germany already collapsing, the loss would have been unnecessary. This explanation appears frequently in memoirs, official histories, and popular accounts. It carries moral weight. It presents restraint as compassion and inaction as responsibility. But when examined closely, the casualty argument does not fully explain the decision that was made. Casualties mattered to Allied planners. That much is undeniable. By 1945, Western governments were acutely sensitive to losses. Public tolerance for continued bloodshed was limited. Soldiers had been fighting for years. Political leaders understood the pressure to end the war quickly. Yet casualty sensitivity did not operate in a vacuum. Throughout the war, Allied commanders repeatedly accepted high losses when they believed strategic objectives justified the cost. Amphibious assaults, frontal attacks against fortified positions, and prolonged campaigns of attrition were all undertaken with full awareness of their human toll. The idea that Berlin alone crossed an unacceptable threshold is therefore questionable. More importantly, casualty estimates for a Berlin assault varied widely. They were not precise predictions. They were projections shaped by assumptions about resistance, timing, and tactics. Some estimates were severe, others were more moderate. None were decisive on their own. What is often omitted from later accounts is that casualty discussions occurred alongside, not instead of, political considerations. They were part of a larger justification framework. In other words, casualties helped explain a decision that had already been shaped by other priorities. Allied planners did not look at Berlin in isolation. They compared it to alternative objectives. Securing southern Germany, for example, was seen as essential for dismantling remaining industrial capacity and preventing the establishment of last-ditch resistance. Advancing into Austria was viewed as important for post-war positioning. These operations also carried risks and costs. Yet, they were approved. The difference was not danger, it was alignment with broader plans. Berlin, by contrast, offered limited strategic return under the prevailing assumptions. Germany's surrender did not depend on its capture by Western forces. The German government was collapsing regardless. The symbolic value of Berlin did not translate into operational necessity. This assessment reduced Berlin's priority, which in turn made its potential casualties seem less justifiable. But this logic is circular. Berlin was deemed non-essential because it lay within a politically assigned zone. Its capture would have disrupted agreements. Therefore, the cost was framed as unnecessary. The casualty argument reinforced the political boundary, rather than defining it. There is another limitation to the casualty explanation: timing. By the time Allied forces were in a position to consider Berlin seriously, the war's end was imminent. Casualty estimates assume a prolonged, desperate defense. In reality, German capacity to sustain such a defense was deteriorating rapidly. Resistance in Berlin was real, but it was also chaotic. The city's defenders were fragmented. Command coherence was weak. Supplies were short. Allied air power was overwhelming. This does not mean casualties would have been light. It means they were not easily predictable, and not necessarily prohibitive. Furthermore, Allied planners were aware that the Red Army would pay an enormous price to take Berlin. That cost was accepted as unavoidable. The question was not whether Berlin would be taken with bloodshed, but whose blood would be shed. This raises an uncomfortable implication. If casualties alone had been decisive, one might expect a shared burden, or at least a serious effort, to contest the city diplomatically or militarily. Instead, Western leaders accepted that Soviet forces would absorb the cost. The casualty argument, when viewed in this light, functions less as a decisive factor and more as a moral cover. It allowed leaders to present restraint as humane while avoiding a direct confrontation over political boundaries. It shifted attention away from the strategic trade-offs being made and toward the human cost that was supposedly being spared. This framing proved powerful after the war. It deflected criticism. It simplified a complex decision. It recast political calculation as moral prudence. But internally, the record suggests a more nuanced reality. Casualties were weighed, but they did not drive the decision independently. They reinforced it. The priority remained avoiding disruption to the emerging post-war order, maintaining alliance coherence, respecting agreed zones, preventing an incident that could escalate into something far more dangerous than a costly battle. From that perspective, Berlin was less a military problem than a diplomatic one. This is why the casualty argument alone cannot explain the consistency of Allied restraint. It cannot account for the deliberate halting of advances, the strict adherence to demarcation lines, or the absence of contingency planning for a Berlin operation. Those patterns reflect policy, not fear. Understanding the limits of the casualty argument is crucial, because it reveals how history is often simplified after the fact. Complex decisions are reduced to single causes. Political trade-offs are recast as moral necessities. In reality, decisions of this magnitude are rarely driven by one factor. Berlin was not avoided solely because it was dangerous. It was avoided because taking it conflicted with assumptions about what would come next. Those assumptions, about cooperation, stability, and shared administration, shaped the entire endgame of the war in Europe. And they were about to be tested, because while Western leaders were calculating restraint, another leader was calculating opportunity. To understand why the decision to let Berlin fall mattered so much, we must examine what the Soviet leadership expected to gain, and how those expectations influenced their actions. As Western Allied armies slowed and redirected their advances in the spring of 1945, the leadership in Moscow was watching closely. To the Soviet command, the restraint of the Western Allies did not signal caution. It signaled confirmation. Confirmation that Berlin would be theirs. For Joseph Stalin, the capture of Berlin was never just about ending the war. It was about defining the peace before it could be negotiated. Military victory in the German capital would create facts on the ground that no conference table could undo. Stalin understood something that Western leaders only partially grasped. In the immediate aftermath of total war, possession mattered more than promises. Berlin represented the administrative, symbolic, and psychological center of Germany. Whoever controlled it would shape the mechanisms of occupation, the narrative of victory, and the balance of leverage in every subsequent discussion about Europe's future. This was not speculation. It was strategy. From the Soviet perspective, the war had devastated their country on a scale unmatched by any other Allied power. Tens of millions were dead. Entire regions were destroyed. Stalin believed, correctly, that the Soviet Union had earned decisive influence over post-war arrangements. Berlin was the visible proof of that claim. Soviet planning reflected this priority. As Red Army forces pushed westward, Berlin was designated as the central objective. Resources were allocated accordingly. Casualties were anticipated and accepted. Speed and inevitability mattered more than preservation. Stalin did not expect the Western Allies to contest the city seriously. He expected them to respect prior understandings, and when Western advances slowed, his assumption hardened into certainty. This expectation shaped Soviet behavior in two critical ways. First, it encouraged urgency. The Red Army accelerated operations to ensure that Berlin would fall decisively and unmistakably under Soviet control. Delay risked complications. Speed eliminated ambiguity. Second, it reduced the incentive for compromise. Stalin did not need to negotiate access to Berlin if he already possessed it. The logic was straightforward. Concessions are made by those who need them. The Western Allies' restraint, intended to preserve cooperation, instead shifted the balance of leverage. From Stalin's vantage point, the situation was ideal. The Western Allies had chosen not to challenge Soviet advances in the East. They had accepted demarcation lines in practice, even if those lines were not yet enforced by treaty. This allowed the Soviet Union to consolidate control rapidly. Berlin became the keystone. Once the Red Army entered the city, everything else followed. Administrative authority, security arrangements, political restructuring, all could be established under the cover of victory. Any later discussions would begin from a position of Soviet dominance. This is why Stalin was willing to absorb the enormous cost of the Berlin assault. Casualties were tragic, but acceptable. What mattered was outcome, not price. Western leaders underestimated this calculus. They believed that cooperation during the war would translate into moderation afterward, that shared sacrifice would produce shared restraint, that the Soviet Union, having suffered so greatly, would seek stability over expansion. Stalin believed something else entirely. He believed that security came from control, that buffers mattered, that influence must be locked in before it could be challenged. Berlin offered the opportunity to do exactly that. The city's capture allowed the Soviet Union to present its presence in Germany as a natural consequence of victory. It framed control as earned rather than negotiated. It turned political arrangements into administrative facts. Once Soviet authority was established in Berlin, the terms of engagement changed. Western leaders could protest, negotiate, or attempt to balance, but they could not dislodge without risking direct confrontation. This asymmetry was not accidental. It was anticipated. Soviet expectations were shaped by earlier experience. In Eastern Europe, the Red Army's presence had already enabled the rapid installation of compliant governments. Control of territory had translated seamlessly into control of politics. Berlin was simply the largest and most consequential example. From Stalin's perspective, Western restraint validated his approach. It demonstrated that the Allies prioritized alliance management over competition, that they were willing to trade symbolic victories for perceived stability. Stalin did not interpret this as goodwill. He interpreted it as opportunity. This difference in interpretation is crucial. Where Western leaders saw restraint as a way to preserve peace, Stalin saw it as a signal that boundaries could be pushed without immediate consequence. Berlin's capture would test that assumption and confirm it. The implications extended beyond Germany. Control of Berlin strengthened the Soviet position across Eastern Europe. It reinforced the legitimacy of Soviet security arrangements. It provided a bargaining chip that would shape negotiations for years. The Western Allies, by contrast, found themselves reacting rather than shaping. They had assumed that the end of the war would be followed by negotiation. Instead, negotiation followed occupation. And occupation favored the side that moved first and fastest. Stalin's expectations were not rooted in trust. They were rooted in precedent. In the aftermath of war, those who held ground dictated terms. Those who hesitated adjusted. Berlin validated that worldview. The Western decision to let the city fall without contest did not produce the cooperative environment many had hoped for. It produced a new reality, one in which leverage had shifted decisively. Understanding Stalin's expectations helps explain why the outcome unfolded as it did. The capture of Berlin was not merely the final act of the war in Europe. It was the opening move of the post-war order, and it revealed a fundamental mismatch between Allied intentions. Western leaders believed restraint would preserve unity. Stalin believed restraint signaled acquiescence. Both acted rationally within their own frameworks. Only one emerged with control. Long before Soviet troops reached Berlin, the conditions that enabled their uncontested entry had already been established, not through battlefield maneuver, but through language. The conferences that shaped the Allied war effort were not merely diplomatic rituals. They were arenas where ambiguity was used deliberately, often to preserve unity in the present at the cost of clarity in the future. Nowhere was this more consequential than in the agreements surrounding Germany's post-war administration. At the heart of the issue was a fundamental tension. The Allies needed cooperation to win the war, but they did not trust one another to shape the peace. The solution was compromise, phrased carefully enough to postpone confrontation. That compromise rested on vague promises. During wartime conferences, leaders spoke in general terms about zones, spheres, coordination, and shared responsibility. The language was flexible by design. It allowed each party to interpret commitments in ways compatible with their own strategic assumptions. For Western leaders, these agreements were frameworks, starting points for negotiation once the war ended. They assumed that implementation would be adjusted as circumstances evolved. For Soviet leadership, the same agreements were permissions, authorization to act decisively within loosely defined boundaries. Berlin sat squarely within this ambiguity. The city's status was discussed in abstract terms. It would be jointly administered. It would be divided into sectors. It would reflect Allied cooperation even within a Soviet zone. These assurances sounded balanced on paper. What they did not specify was timing, sequencing, or enforcement. They did not say who would enter Berlin first. They did not say how control would be established before joint administration began. They did not say how facts created by military occupation would be reconciled afterward. This silence mattered. In wartime diplomacy, what is left unsaid often carries more weight than what is written. The absence of constraints created space for initiative, and initiative favors the actor willing to move fastest. Western leaders assumed that goodwill would fill the gaps. That shared victory would moderate behavior. That post-war negotiations would proceed in an atmosphere of mutual restraint. Soviet leadership assumed the opposite. They understood that ambiguity could be exploited. That control established first would define later discussion. That agreements without enforcement mechanisms were invitations rather than restrictions. This difference in interpretation was not accidental. It reflected fundamentally different experiences and strategic cultures. Western leaders were accustomed to diplomacy in which agreements evolved through continued negotiation. Soviet leadership operated in a world where security was secured through control, not consensus. Berlin was where these worldviews collided. The agreements allowed the Soviet Union to argue, accurately, that Berlin lay within its designated operational sphere. They also allowed the Western allies to reassure themselves that joint administration would prevent unilateral dominance. Both interpretations could coexist only until one side acted. Once Soviet forces entered Berlin, the ambiguity collapsed. The city was no longer a theoretical administrative entity. It was a physical space under Soviet military authority. At that point, promises about shared administration became secondary to realities on the ground. Western leaders found themselves bound by their own language. They had accepted a framework that prioritized cooperation over enforcement. Contesting Berlin after the fact would have required not just military action, but a repudiation of the agreements that had underpinned the alliance. That was a step they were unwilling to take. The irony is that these agreements were not written to surrender Berlin. They were written to avoid conflict. But by deferring specificity, they created conditions in which conflict was merely postponed rather than prevented. Berlin's fall exposed the cost of that postponement. Once Soviet authority was established, implementing joint administration became a matter of negotiation rather than parity. Access, movement, and governance were all subject to Soviet consent. Western presence existed, but it existed within a framework defined by initial occupation. This pattern repeated across Eastern Europe. Agreements that promised pluralism and cooperation were overtaken by Fayette's accomplice. Control preceded consultation. Administration followed occupation. Berlin was simply the most visible case. The Western Allies had believed that flexibility preserved unity. In practice, it preserved options. for the side most willing to exploit them. The conference promises did not fail because they were violated outright. They failed because they were imprecise. They relied on trust where leverage was required. This does not mean that Western leaders were naive. Many understood the risks, but they prioritized immediate victory over future confrontation. The war was still being fought. Unity mattered more than foresight. Berlin was the price of that choice. By the time the consequences became clear, reversing them would have required a level of escalation that no one was prepared to contemplate. The war had just ended. Public opinion demanded demobilization, not confrontation. The appetite for another crisis was non-existent, and so the ambiguity remained unresolved. What had been framed as temporary arrangements hardened into lasting divisions. Promises made to preserve cooperation instead facilitated consolidation. Berlin became a city of agreements, interpreted after the fact. Understanding this helps explain why the Western Allies did not simply lose Berlin. They enabled its capture through a series of choices that prioritized short-term alliance management over long-term clarity. Those choices were understandable. They were also consequential, because once ambiguity was resolved by action, it could not be restored by negotiation. The agreements that had allowed Berlin to fall were never formally repudiated. They were quietly reinterpreted. Their intent was remembered differently by each side, and in that divergence lay the foundation of the post-war divide. Berlin did not become contested because agreements failed. It became contested because agreements succeeded, just not in the way their authors expected. When Western leaders chose not to contest Berlin, they did not believe they were surrendering leverage. They believed they were purchasing stability. The decision rested on a set of expectations, reasonable on the surface, deeply flawed in practice, about what restraint would yield once the war ended. At the core of these expectations was a belief in reciprocity. Western governments assumed that honoring wartime understandings would be met with restraint on the other side. That cooperation during victory would translate into cooperation during settlement. That goodwill, demonstrated at a critical moment, would moderate post-war behavior. This assumption shaped how the decision was justified internally. By avoiding a race to Berlin, Western leaders believed they were preventing a dangerous rupture in the alliance. They expected that shared administration of Germany would function as promised, that political pluralism would be allowed to develop within occupation zones, that disagreements could be managed through negotiation rather than force. In this framework, Berlin was a bargaining chip deferred, not surrendered. Western leaders believed that by respecting agreed boundaries, they preserved the moral high ground and the legitimacy of the post-war order. Any later disputes, they assumed, would be resolved through institutions, conferences, and diplomacy, not faillites accomplice. This belief was reinforced by wartime necessity. The alliance had held under extraordinary pressure. Cooperation had been real. Coordination had worked. It was tempting to assume that this pattern would continue once the common enemy was gone. But the assumption contained a fatal flaw. It presumed that both sides interpreted cooperation in the same way. For Western governments, cooperation meant rules, processes, and mutual restraint. For Soviet leadership, cooperation meant freedom of action within broadly defined limits. The two concepts overlapped during war. They diverged sharply afterward. Western leaders expected several specific outcomes from restraint. First, they expected joint administration to act as a moderating force. By sharing responsibility for Germany, they believed that extremes would be avoided. No single power would dominate. Disagreements would require compromise. Second, they expected political diversity to survive within occupation zones. While acknowledging ideological differences, They believed that pluralism would be tolerated, at least initially. The idea was not immediate convergence, but coexistence. Third, they expected time to work in their favor. They believed that the urgency of wartime control would ease, that demobilization would reduce tension, and that economic recovery would encourage stability over confrontation. In short, they expected normalization. These expectations were not naive in isolation. They reflected Western experience after previous conflicts and a deep desire to avoid another cycle of escalation. But they underestimated the asymmetry created by control of territory. The problem was not that these expectations were unreasonable. It was that they were unenforceable. Once Soviet forces controlled Berlin, the balance of leverage shifted. Joint administration existed on paper, but initial authority rested with the power that had entered first. Access, movement, and security were all mediated by that authority. Western participation became conditional rather than equal. The assumption that shared responsibility would moderate behavior proved optimistic. In practice, shared responsibility required consensus. Consensus required leverage, and leverage had already been lost. Western leaders also underestimated the speed with which post-war realities would solidify. They assumed there would be a period of transition during which arrangements could be refined. Instead, administrative structures were erected rapidly. Security apparatuses were established. Political alignments were shaped before meaningful negotiation could occur. The window for adjustment closed faster than expected. Another expectation that failed was the belief that restraint would build trust. Western leaders believed that by avoiding provocation, they reduced the likelihood of confrontation. They assumed that visible cooperation would encourage reciprocal caution. But restraint can be interpreted in multiple ways. Where Western leaders saw responsibility, Soviet leadership saw opportunity. Where one side saw compromise, the other saw confirmation that boundaries could be pressed without immediate cost. This mismatch was not corrected because it was not openly confronted. Western governments were reluctant to acknowledge that their expectations were not being met. Doing so would have required reassessing decisions that had been publicly framed as prudent and humane. It would have meant admitting that restraint had produced the opposite of its intended effect. Instead, disappointment was managed quietly. Concerns were raised internally. Reports grew more pessimistic. Language hardened behind closed doors. But public posture remained conciliatory, even as confidence eroded. The decision to let Berlin fall thus produced a paradox. It preserved alliance unity at the moment of victory, but it undermined the foundations of post-war cooperation. By avoiding immediate conflict, it enabled a longer, deeper division. Western leaders had believed they were trading a symbolic victory for practical stability. In reality, they traded leverage for uncertainty. This does not mean that contesting Berlin would have guaranteed a better outcome. It would have carried risks of its own. But it does mean that the choice was not cost-free and that its costs were underestimated. The expectation that restraint would be reciprocated was central to the decision. When that expectation failed, Western governments found themselves reacting rather than shaping events. The consequences extended beyond Berlin. The pattern established there, of ambiguity resolved by occupation, of cooperation overridden by control, repeated across Eastern Europe. Each instance reinforced the last. Each reduced the space for negotiation. Berlin became not just a city, but a precedent. The Western belief that they would gain moderation in return for restraint proved to be one of the most consequential miscalculations of the war's end. It was rooted in a desire for stability, but it underestimated how power operates in the immediate aftermath of total war. Normalization did not precede control. Control preceded normalization. And once control was established, normalization followed terms set by those who held it. Understanding this miscalculation is essential because it explains why later efforts to rebalance influence faced such resistance. The leverage that might have been used at the moment of victory had already been spent. The decision not to contest Berlin did not simply shape the city's fate. It shaped the assumptions that governed the early Cold War. Those assumptions would soon be tested, openly, repeatedly, and at increasing cost. The fall of Berlin did not produce a pause. It produced momentum. Within days of Soviet forces entering the city, the abstract assumptions that had shaped Allied restraint were replaced by concrete administrative realities. Control was no longer theoretical. It was exercised. What followed happened faster than most Western leaders had anticipated. Security structures were established immediately. Soviet military authorities assumed responsibility for order, movement, and access. Key buildings, transportation nodes, and communication centers were secured. Administrative decisions were made under the authority of the occupying power that had arrived first. This was not extraordinary behavior. It was standard practice after total war. But it carried consequences that extended far beyond Berlin itself. The presence of Soviet forces meant that every subsequent arrangement began from an unequal position. Joint administration, which had been discussed in diplomatic terms, now had to operate within a framework shaped by prior occupation. Western access existed, but it existed conditionally. Movement into and within Berlin required agreement. Logistics depended on cooperation. Political activity unfolded under supervision already in place. These were not violations of agreements. They were the practical effects of being first. The Western Allies soon realized that control of Berlin could not be negotiated backward. The city had become an administrative fact. Any attempt to alter that fact would require confrontation, not diplomacy. That realization set limits on response. Western leaders protested selectively. They raised concerns. They pressed for implementation of shared arrangements, but they avoided steps that might escalate into open conflict. The war had just ended. Public appetite for another crisis was non-existent. This restraint had been intended as a virtue. It now became a constraint. Berlin's administration moved quickly from military control to political structuring. Local authorities were selected. Security services expanded. Media outlets were reorganized. Political activity was shaped through regulation rather than overt force. To Western observers, this process unfolded with uncomfortable speed. They had expected a period of negotiation before structures hardened. Instead, structure preceded negotiation. By the time discussions resumed in earnest, the framework had already been set. This pattern repeated across Eastern Europe. But Berlin magnified its impact. The city's symbolic weight meant that decisions taken there reverberated outward. Control of Berlin implied influence over Germany's future. Influence over Germany implied influence over Europe's balance. The Western Allies found themselves adapting to a new reality they had helped enable. Their presence in Berlin existed, but it was constrained. Access routes became points of leverage. Administrative participation depended on cooperation. Every disagreement risked disruption of arrangements that were already fragile. This asymmetry shaped behavior. Western leaders became cautious about escalation. They weighed every move against the risk of confrontation. The more time passed, the more costly reversal appeared. Berlin did not become contested gradually. It became contested immediately, but within limits set by the initial occupation. Those limits proved durable. Once established, administrative control created its own logic. Security concerns justified continued presence. Continued presence justified further consolidation. Each step reinforced the last. The Western Allies had assumed that joint administration would function as a balance. In practice, it functioned as a negotiation conducted from unequal positions. This imbalance did not result from deception. It resulted from timing. Whoever arrived first defined the starting conditions. Agreements then adjusted to those conditions rather than reshaping them. The consequences of this dynamic were not limited to governance. They extended to perception. Berlin became a visible marker of post-war power. The image of Soviet troops in the German capital carried psychological weight. It reinforced narratives of victory and legitimacy. It shaped how populations across Europe interpreted the outcome of the war. For the Western Allies, this created a dilemma. Challenging that image risked confrontation. Accepting it risked conceding influence. The decision not to contest Berlin militarily now constrained political options. This dilemma was not resolved, it was managed. Western leaders sought to stabilize their position elsewhere. They consolidated influence in their own zones. They focused on economic recovery, political integration, and alliance building. Berlin remained an exception, important, symbolic, but difficult to alter. The city became a microcosm of the emerging divide. What had begun as a decision to avoid conflict now required constant effort to prevent it. Each incident, each dispute, each administrative disagreement carried the risk of escalation. The very restraint that had enabled Soviet control now limited Western response. This is the core consequence often overlooked. The decision to let Berlin fall without contest did not buy peace. It bought time, and time, once bought, must be used to rebalance conditions. In Berlin, rebalancing proved extraordinarily difficult. The city's status hardened faster than expected. Administrative arrangements became routine. Routine became precedent. Precedent became norm. By the time Western leaders fully grasped the permanence of what had been established, the cost of reversal was prohibitive. Berlin had ceased to be a bargaining chip. It had become a line. This line did not end negotiation, but it framed it. Everything that followed, access disputes, political standoffs, symbolic confrontations, took place within boundaries set in 1945. The immediate consequences of letting Berlin fall were therefore not confined to the end of the war. They shaped the opening phase of a new one. A conflict not declared, but structured. A confrontation not initiated, but inherited. Understanding this immediacy is essential. It shows that the decision's impact was not deferred. It was felt almost at once, and it explains why later efforts to adjust Berlin's status were so fraught. The window for shaping the city's fate closed quickly. Not because of inevitability, but because once control is established in the aftermath of war, undoing it requires more than argument. It requires willingness to confront. And in 1945, that willingness did not exist. In the decades since the war, the fall of Berlin has often been portrayed as a foregone conclusion. A matter of timing, of geography, of who happened to arrive first. That framing is comforting. It suggests inevitability, and inevitability absolves responsibility. But the record tells a different story. Berlin did not fall to the Soviets because the Western Allies were incapable of reaching it. It fell because they chose not to contest it. That choice was not accidental, and it was not made in ignorance. It was made deliberately, under pressure, and with a clear set of expectations about what restraint would achieve. Those expectations proved mistaken. Western leaders believed that respecting political boundaries would preserve cooperation. That restraint would be reciprocated. That the post-war order could be shaped gradually through negotiation rather than immediately through control. They believed the war's end would be followed by diplomacy. Instead, diplomacy followed occupation. The Soviet leadership understood something fundamental about the moment of victory. Power crystallizes fastest in the immediate aftermath of war. Control exercised then becomes legitimacy later. Agreements written without enforcement are overridden by facts created on the ground. Berlin was the clearest demonstration of that principle. By allowing the Soviet Union to take the city uncontested, the Western Allies did not merely concede a symbol. They ceded leverage at the precise moment. Leverage mattered most. Everything that followed, the structure of German division, the balance in Eastern Europe, the tone of early Cold War confrontation was shaped by that initial condition. This does not mean that racing for Berlin would have guaranteed a better outcome. It would have carried enormous risks. It might have produced confrontation at the moment of victory. It might have fractured the alliance before the war officially ended. But it does mean that the choice was not cost-free. The cost was deferred rather than avoided. By prioritizing short-term stability, Western leaders accepted long-term division. By avoiding immediate conflict, they enabled a slower, deeper one. The city they chose not to contest became the focal point of confrontation for generations. Berlin became a place where the consequences of wartime decisions were lived daily. Blockades, airlifts, walls, all flowed from the reality established in 1945. The most revealing aspect of this history is not that Berlin fell, but how rarely the decision behind it is examined honestly. The story is often softened, simplified, or attributed to fate. Political calculation is recast as inevitability. Choices are hidden behind casualty figures and logistical charts. But wars do not end only on battlefields. They end in conference rooms, in headquarters, and in moments where restraint is chosen over action. Those moments shape the peace as decisively as any offensive. Berlin was one of those moments. It was the point where military victory intersected with political caution, and where caution produced consequences its authors did not fully anticipate. Understanding this does not require assigning blame. It requires recognizing agency. The Allies let Berlin fall not because they were forced to, but because they believed they could manage the outcome afterward. History suggests otherwise. The city that was avoided in 1945 became the symbol of everything that followed. A divided Europe, a divided Germany, a divided world. And all of it traced back to a decision made quietly, deliberately, and with the best intentions, at the exact moment when intention mattered less than position. Berlin was not lost in combat. It was conceded in advance. If you want the classified version of World War II, the decisions made behind closed doors, not the myths polished later, subscribe to WW2 Declassified. Because the real history of the war is written where strategy meets politics. And if you want to support this work directly, you can do that on Patreon. Your support helps fund long-form research, archival sourcing, and documentaries that don't rush to simplify history for clicks. The link is in the description.